Welcome to Storymakers, the Storymakers podcast, a place where curiosity and play meet to spark faith through the imagination. I'm your host, Mel, and I will introduce you to new friends who will share hope for the kids and teens in your life, with a dose of encouragement for us grown-ups too. Let's get the party started. Hey, Storymakers, welcome back to Storymaker Pod. I'm super pumped up because I have a great friend who you're going to love and adore, and I can't wait for you to read her. This is Amber from Heritage Mom, and we are so excited to have you. Thank you so much, Amber, for being with us today. Can you just share with us a little bit about yourself and where people can find you? And you're a mom of four, you're in Georgia.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. My husband, Scott, and I live outside of Atlanta, Georgia, but we're both from the Midwest. We met here and we are raising four Georgia babies, four Southern babies. So that makes it a lot of fun. Our kids are 15, 13, 11, and 9.
Wow.
And we are a homeschooling family. We are a world schooling family. We love global travel. And I write and speak as Heritage Mom, and people can find me at heritagemom.com and on socials at Heritage Mom Blog. And I talk about a variety of things, but my biggest passion is inserting diverse images, books, and stories into children's lives.
It's so awesome. Thank you so much for being with us. Today, we're going to be talking about how mamas are storied too. We can feel sometimes, I think, as moms, parents, wherever you land on that spectrum, that our lives are a little frayed, and it's hard to sort of regroup and find our own story in the mix of caretaking and educating our kids and all of those things. And so today I'm so excited to have Amber because we're going to be talking about parents being storied and our kids being storied. And I think what Amber just mentioned about introducing lots of literature and expanding our kids' imaginations around stories is so important and vital for us. So this is really exciting. Amber has a new book out. It is called, I'm so sorry. It is called Soul School. Sorry, it was like Soul School. And we're so excited for it. Amber, can you just tell us a little bit about your new book that's coming out?
Sure. So in my first book, A Place to Belong, I spent 3 chapters talking about books, but that was just one section of the book. And then as I was visiting book clubs and speaking across the country, everyone kept coming back to those chapters. It was eliciting a lot of emotion, a lot of questions, lots of conversations. And I thought there's something there that we all still want to discuss. And I want to dig in more deeply. So Soul School comes out of that idea. And specifically, it is a love letter to Black children's literature.
Mm-hmm.
The books and the illustrations that really bring Black American culture, especially, but across the diaspora, to life for our children. The beautiful things that they can read about and see. And it goes from toddlers all the way through teens. Half of the book is about Black American culture and the beauty of it and these different important aspects of what you can expect to find in children's literature. And so I kind of explain that to parents and teachers or whoever's reading. And then the second half of the book are these really great annotated book lists with all my thoughts and questions and activities and all the things. And so I think it is part reference tool, but also it's something that I hope touches people emotionally, and that hence the name Soul School. So it's soul, like, Black soul, but it's also, these are books that touch our children's soul.
I loved what you wrote in your book when you mentioned when reviewing history books for young children, you're always looking for beautiful stories written with engaging artwork. And obviously here in Storymaker World, we're all about expanding the imagination.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the conversations around exposing kids to more voices and different stories and cultural contexts, I think sometimes people can feel defensive about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way that you framed it and the way that you're shaping our exposure is really this idea of like the expansion of our imagination. This idea that there's a limitation when all the stories aren't right there, and the good stories and well-written literature that we miss out on. And so I think that's part of what seemed so special about this book, is that we have the opportunity to expand the imaginations of our kids, and for grown-ups too. Like we said, mamas and papas, they're storied too. And when we are exposed to these wider, I think, stories, then our own imaginations are reshaped too. We can always be expanding and learning, which is so exciting. So one of the
Absolutely.
things I wanted to touch on, I really love this book so much. So everyone pre-order it now. It's going to launch at the end of January. It is so well written, Amber. I was just so appreciative of your melody and your tone. And I read a lot of books for parents, and this was just a pure joy. So one of the things I wanted to touch on, you had sort of a highlight. Amber and I spoke a little bit before the pod went on, but she has this highlight around windows and mirrors. And Amber, I'd love for you to just talk to us a little bit about what that means in terms of exposing and validating through story.
Mhm. I think that so literary mirrors, books that where children can see themselves and their families and their communities reflected and appreciated, and get this feeling that we are worth someone writing about. There's someone who sees me, who knows me, who recognizes where I come from and the people that I spend my time around. And they wrote a beautiful story about us, or a hard story about us, or a joyful story, or a fun story about us. And I think that that's an important part of literature. And I talk a lot through the lens of ethnicity and culture, but really mirrors show up and have shown up for my kids in many different ways, and for myself. So I've given examples of where, books that no one would ever expect, My Antonia, for instance, and I saw myself in that book. And A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and there was a character that I'm like, oh my gosh, I see this little aspect of myself in there. And those are books that have nothing at all to do with Black culture. And so it transcends culture and ethnicity. But for our children, I see that as a place where book lists have been lacking for a long time, and in a lot of spaces, and they're heavily contested in today's, where we are today. So books as windows, wonderfully, these are the same books in a lot of cases, but it's about how the child sees the book, which the child changes, the book doesn't change. And books as windows are books where our kids can look at that book, read that book, and see, get a glimpse of how someone else lives, of how they see the world and how they experience, and how their families and their community are moving through life. And I think that a beautiful mixture of both of those, mirrors and windows, on our children's shelves and on our shelves as well, helps, like you said, about that fueling the imagination and expanding our experiences through literature.
Yeah, I just read this book called The Storytelling Animal. I don't know if you've read that book, but he talks about how we are soaked to the bone in story, and you find meaning, and you're sort of like rationalizing and moving through life through story oftentimes. And so when we have limitations as to what those stories can look like or be, and it's hard to tell, right? You don't know like what kind of story is going to hit you per se. Not everything is so prescriptive, but having just the exposure on opportunity to experience the diversity of story is an opportunity for our kids to be like, I feel seen, or I feel validated, and what a gift that is. I read books as a kid, and I just felt like, oh, I like the BFG felt like such a story that I connected to, which is so different from where I was from,
Yeah.
the kind of kid I was. I wasn't an orphan. I didn't encounter giants. But those kinds of, you just don't know. And so it's like, why not expose them to more things that could open their minds, and to be known and to feel seen in that way.
I think it's really important, and it also gives our kids an opportunity for people and things to be more familiar. So they meet someone, and that doesn't mean that person is just like the character in the book. That's not true. But you can say, "I'm familiar with that.
Mm.
I I have experienced that." Like there's a book called Pride by E.B. Savoy. It's a remake of Pride and Prejudice, and the food that her Afro-Latina family is eating throughout the book, it just kept resonating with me. And I'm like, oh, because when I go to my girl's house, her mom always used to have that. And so I'm building bridges here in familiarity. Does my family eat that food? No,
Mm.
but it was a connection to someone else that I've met and a familiarity and saying like, oh, okay, that wasn't just my friend's mom's making up that dish. That's from her culture. And I think that that's where a lot of the beauty comes in. But then that book is Black characters, so people would say, well, that's a mirror for you. And
Mm.
I'm saying it's both, right?
Yeah.
And most books are. So I think it's beautiful.
I love that so much. This idea about windows and mirrors as we think about literature for our kids and exposing them to stories. So I think everyone out there listening to this, like really sink in on that idea, like windows and mirrors, like what are we exposing our kids to? What are we offering them the opportunity towards? We always, I think, in so many ways, like Jesus really expanded the table to all people. And I think books have that opportunity, like what parables did. They have that functionality to say, like, I'm exposing you to something, or I'm validating you towards something. So I think that's definitely worth sitting and thinking about. The other, Storymakers loves to live in the happy joy space, and I loved your highlight on Black joy. I would love for you to share a little bit more about that, Amber. It was such an encouragement to me.
Yeah. So I think that I list Black joy as one of the things I'm looking for when I'm looking at Black children's literature, because so much of the Black American experience that has been shared in books can be very heavy. It can be very sad. And those things are true and good to read about, but that's not the totality of who we are, or that's not what we only think about when we think about ourselves. There is this idea of Black joy, and it's not something that's manufactured, like jump on stage and start tap dancing for the audience, like I'm joyful. See, it's something that comes like from within, right? And I think that it's a protective space that we
Mm.
have developed. And it says that these things may happen, but you can control this, you can control that, you can control all of these external factors in my life, but you cannot rob me of my joy. I think it ties back biblically, and hard times are going to come. You're going to have enemies, people are going to do something, but that's not the source of our ultimate joy.
Mm.
And I've seen that play out with my family in our global travels, where we'll be standing in the midst of what looks like complete and utter devastation to our eyes. And
Mhm.
yet here they are inviting us for dinner, sharing what they have, dancing, asking us questions, and enthusiastically engaging, and grabbing my kids for soccer games and doing all this. And I'm like, these people, they have joy. So though we look at them and say, I don't see how they could, but they do.
Mm.
And I think that it's not exclusive to Black people, but it's something that, along with other aspects of our culture, is unique in how it manifests.
I love that. We were just, recently in this last year, my chair of the board and I we were in the middle of nowhere in Mexico, in a little village who had been devastated by an earthquake. And we got to do stories together, and there was
Mm.
so much joy. And, you're in a place where people seemingly are lacking or challenged in so many ways. And on paper, it would seem right that you wouldn't have joy opportunities, but through story and encouragement and community and being together, there was just an abundance beyond an abundance. And so I think that there's so much for us to, be captured by this idea of Black joy. And it's not just an idea; it's a reality. But there is so much, I think, for us all to really be encouraged by so deeply. Storing ourselves with hope despite circumstance, I think, is such a Christian principle.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk right now around resiliency and where our kids are, and they're not okay. Gen Z and Alpha have all sorts of challenges. But one of the things I thought that was so impactful and so wise was this idea around building resiliency through story.
Mm.
And I think seeing characters who sort of make it through, or our kids are able to build resiliency, I think is so important. Could you tell us a little bit about that, Amber?
Yeah.
How you highlight that?
I think that it's seeing characters, like you said, or if it's a nonfiction book, true stories of people who have overcome, who have experienced things. One is the story of how they overcame. That helps our children, but I think also it's about expectations. If our kids expect life to be easy and for
Mhm.
nothing bad to ever happen, or not to experience challenges or roadblocks, then when they do experience it, it feels devastating. Like it's all unraveling. My whole life is coming apart. But if they have had plenty of episodes and plenty of time to hear all of these stories of people, they can look at this and say, I know what this is. This
Mhm.
is hard times. I'm in a valley, but I'm
Mhm.
going to be back on the mountain. This is not going to stay. I won't remain here in this valley. I know that this is how life is and that things happen to us, but they will walk with the full expectation that things will get better. I think that they'll see how it's rare like that you're going to have a book with just one person.
Mhm.
Books have sets of characters and they interact with each other, and they'll be able to see how when you're down, there's someone around you, hopefully, who's up and can help you along. And then when you're on your mountaintop, you're going to be looking in the valley to see who you can grab to come along on this ride with you. And all of that plays out in fiction and it plays out in nonfiction. And I know one thing that I often tell parents to be careful of is parents will tell me, I don't want my kids to read these books because these books are
Mhm.
hard or sad
Mhm.
and bad things happen. And so they'll be sad and they'll feel bad. Not necessarily, because we as adults have we have our lenses as to how we see things and how things play out. But what I found with my own children is I'm like, this book is really heavy. How do you feel? They're like, I feel great because I love hearing these stories. I love knowing what happened. I love knowing what my people did, or how these other people survived something that was terrible, but they kept going, mama. And I'm
Mhm.
like, oh my gosh, I didn't
I
even
was
think about it that way.
I was so encouraged by that,
Yeah.
and I think about that with kids and stories in the Bible too, and the anxiety around like what's appropriate or what's too much, or is this going to be like too much exposure? But the reality is that they are going to face hard times, right? And if they don't have practice being exposed to how people move through those hard times, like you said, it'll be much more devastating once they actually experience what you said, hard times.
Yeah.
And it's so right, from our adult perspectives and our own adult imaginations, oftentimes we think, well, our kids are going to be really devastated by this story, this information. And oftentimes they surprise us. They
Yeah.
surprise us all the time with how they respond to story and how where they're taking that story in their own minds.
Yep.
And so I love that. And I think with all the talk about Gen Z and Alpha, anxiety and depression on the rise. I think there's so much to be said about resiliency being found in story. And so, yeah, Amber, what do you think about this whole idea about the literary life?
Mm.
How stories helping us make meaning and helping us sort of move through the ebb and flows of what comes our way.
Yeah. Well, I think people have said, Amber, do you think you focus too much on books? And I'm like, well, of course, that's my thing, right? You wouldn't ask a baker if she focuses on cakes too much.
Yeah, exactly.
So yes, probably, right? That's something that I'm passionate about, but I really do believe that books have the power to help and to heal. And to expose. And this literary life is an idea where you're kind of books are part of who you are. They're a part of our home. I would say we have a literary home, and you are a reader, and you are able to find parallels and correlation through literature into what's happening in your life or in the world around you at times, that you get lost in books just for
Mhm.
enjoyment. And everybody will have different types of books. I'm really big about that. Like, there isn't just this one list and you're like, oh, I read Great Expectations and I didn't like it, so I must not be a reader because that's supposed to be a great book. Well, maybe that's just not your thing.
Yeah.
And so, but
That's a
there's
really hard book.
something, yeah, there's something that's your thing, even if it's like nonfiction, maybe that's your thing and you just really love reading about plumbing and piping. I mean, I don't know. There's something there for you. And um, I I feel like for some of us that has to be intentional. I know some people are like, well, I've always been like this. I just am a reader. That's true, but I guess you can develop readers as
Mhm.
well. And I didn't leave that up for chance with my kids.
Mhm.
There are books laying around our house all over. I sacrificed the perfect look or meticulous cleaning.
Aesthetic.
And
You're
yes,
perfectly perfect.
yes, books are part of our aesthetic.
Yeah,
Stack
exactly.
of books, I'm like, "Just straighten them up, that's fine, you can still leave them there."
Like, that's a whole aesthetic itself.
Yes, and books for gifts. So, when every birthday, every Christmas, my children each one receives a book that I especially curated and picked out for them in that particular
Mhm.
moment. And so I made it a big deal. Like, here's your book for this year, and here's why I picked this for you, or whatever. So I think that we can make things special for our kids by the way that we speak about them. And then I've modeled that the kids see me reading a lot and talking about books, having a culture in our family where we discuss books a lot,
Mm.
over the kitchen table and car rides and all of that. And so if you haven't read the book, if you're one of the siblings that hasn't read that book yet, you're going to be left out and you're like, wait, I don't get the inside joke. And
Yeah.
so, we have a lot of books that we've all read or we all listen to the audiobook on a road trip. And those are shared bonding moments. It's inexpensive. We can take them with us anywhere. Um, they're easily accessible. And that's something I don't take for granted because in some of our travels, I see that there are plenty of places in this world where books are not
Mm.
easily accessible. So that's a gift, a privilege that we have that we want to really take advantage of. But I think that one of the things I was going to say about the literary life that helps is you talked about resilience and grit. And I think that some people feel like we need to put our kids into difficult situations to make them develop grit and
Mm.
resiliency. And I saw an article once and it said, well, the world is a cold place, but you don't take away your kid's blanket at night while they're
Mhm.
sleeping so they can prepare for it. And that really resonated with me. I don't
Mhm.
like the idea of falsely creating bad things to allow bad things to happen to my children. They're precious, right? And I don't want anyone to intentionally make bad things happen in my life. I think life brings enough our way naturally.
Yeah.
We can help prepare our kids with the discussions through story. Um, and it also, you think of in the book, I talk about Black folks and food, and we have food when the baby's
It
born,
made me
food when you're
so
married.
hungry.
Yeah, it's such a big part of our
It's like,
culture. Food when people die,
get ready. You should
celebrated.
have a snack when you read the book.
Yes, and I think that story goes along with that. When the
Mm.
baby's born, people are telling stories. When someone's married, you get on the mic, you're toasting, you're telling a story. Someone passes, what do? We stand on stage, we tell
Mhm.
stories about them. That's how we bring closure to things. It's how we celebrate things, and it's so interesting to me that it's parallel there with the food. But you're not just eating; you're eating and telling stories. That's how we
Yes, and
remember
the
people.
people's recipes, and
Yes.
this came from somewhere, and yeah, it's so primal, so I would say, especially to all the parents out there who feel, maybe they feel challenged or thinking, oh, well, it's really impossible to build in literacy or this love of reading at my home because my kids are just not readers, or, they rather do this or that, or they're sporty or whatever. But I think the stories, as you say, are just, they're so primal, and it's what we do to, like, to sort of navigate through life, right? Through the beginning, from cradle to, grave. So stories are so important, and it's a safe way to practice this idea of like challenges come towards us. It's not taking the blanket away, but it's a way for them to be exposed to those challenges in a way that's appropriate, and where they can begin to imagine, because the imagination is so powerful, how they would navigate a scenario that's challenging or difficult. And I think that's really important. I love that idea you talked about. And I think this is a good tip, especially for grownups who feel like, I don't know, this is going to be really hard for me to incorporate or to add more story to life. But the idea around stolen moments and more books at the same time. I love that. I think that's a great takeaway for parents and grownups who feel like I don't have time or my kids are too resistant towards it. Could you say a little bit more about that, Amber, especially for parents who may be feeling like, oh, this is going to be challenging for me to incorporate it, but I do think it's so important to really give it a go.
Yes. One thing I want to say too is you probably shouldn't have the expectation in your own family that all of your kids are just going to fall in love with books just because you are intentional about it. And I want to make sure people know, I have kids all along the spectrum, and that for me, we're talking about books, but oral storytelling is just as important. So the stories you tell when you guys are gathered up on a Friday night or roasting s'mores over the fire, your stories for that particular child may not be written stories. They may be stories that are orally told and shared. And so don't be intimidated by that. I think this idea of stolen moments, people often don't read because they don't have big chunks of time, because that's how we read a lot of times in school. It's like you're assigned chapter 7 in this textbook tonight. It's going to take you forever. If you don't have that time, you're like, I don't have time to read. Yeah. I think that most of my reading comes through stolen moments. So I always have books with me, either a hard copy or I have the Kindle or that's on my phone or whatever, or audiobook going. And so if I'm waiting in line at the bank, if I'm at Starbucks waiting for them to make my drink, or when I'm in the car, definitely if I'm in the car by myself, I'm listening to a book, maybe when I'm with the kids as well, because sometimes they, I don't want them listening to my book. But I think that if you think of it as minutes or stolen moments, these moments add up to hours, and hours add up to completed books. And it's not a race. Like I always say, I don't have time to read. Well, let's just say it took you 2 years to finish that one book. It's not going to, but let's just say it did. So what? What if I said, so what? Like that was a 2-year book for you. Like, are you going somewhere? Do you have somewhere to be? It's not for school. It's not an assignment. So especially as adults, like just sit with it and be fine with that. You read 1 page this week, so be it. And then read a page next week, you're fine. So taking the pressure off of that, I think is a really important aspect. And then I found that, I don't know who said this, it's a famous quote, but he said something to the effect of, sometimes a change is as good as a break. And I really feel that way about reading. So I like to keep multiple books going. And, you can have a really hard, difficult, heavy book maybe, and something really light and fun. I like to read cookbooks, which is really nerdy.
Oh no, I love that too.
So like if it's just recipes, I'm like, nah, but
No,
I like to read the story.
Where'd that come from?
Oh my gosh. I love that. I love the story behind people's dishes, or Edna Lewis, who is this famous Black chef. She's passed on, but in one of her cookbooks I was reading, she was just talking about her family, whatever. And she was talking about how they always had a ham in the smokehouse for whenever somebody would come. And she was like, when I was growing up, a ham was the same as a little black dress. You always got to have one, always be ready. And I thought, oh my gosh, a ham is the same as a little black dress. Like, girl, you got to have some meat here for when folks come by. And I just loved that. So I think that having different types of books keeps me constantly reading, because I may have a few moments to read, but I don't feel like reading that. I'm not in the mood for that. So instead of not reading, I switch and grab the book that I am in the mood for. And I have taught that to my kids as well.
I love that. Well, I apply the same logic. usually have kids books on hand, lots of picture books, lots of, I mean, I do have kids, but they're teenagers now. They're not
Mhm.
reading them. I am. And or middle grade books, and alongside like parenting, theology, philosophy books. I have like the heavy stuff, and then, like one chapter into heavy thing. And it's like, maybe I want to read James and the Giant Peach right now.
Yeah.
And just being able to have that flexibility. And I love that idea of like, yeah, where are you going? Like, well, why do you need to close the loop on this book right away? But it's, I think just the stories just help us even problem solve and rethink things in a way we may have not come up with on our own. And I think stories really affords us that.
Mhm.
Well, Amber, it's been such a pleasure to have you with us. And everyone, please pre-order this book, Soul School. You are going to love it, and bring a snack with you as well. But Amber, if you were to leave anything with our Storymaker fans today, our listeners, what would you suggest? Maybe, obviously get the Soul School book, but what else are you reading or suggesting for families to engage with story?
I would also say poetry is a love of
Mm,
mine. And so even if you don't have the time to start a new book, a chapter book or anything like that, just a poem, right? Just a poem that can set you thinking. And you
mm,
talk about sparking imagination. That's the poetry. That's what it does.
mm,
So I would say grab a book from a poet that is similar to you. So you
mm,
and curl up on the couch and feel comforted, and then grab a book from a poet who's completely different from you, so your
mm,
eyes will be opened, and receive some type of familiarity in a different way. So that's one thing I would say. I am reading right now a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous
ooh,
Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. So it's by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she is Native American, and she talks about her relationship with the outside world and with plants in particular. But the way that she writes, it makes you want to like cry. Like you think of these plants, and you're like, oh my gosh, like this is so beautiful. This connection.
mhm,
And it's just a wonderful book. And she has a young adult version that my teens are also reading. And then I'm also reading this book called Yonder Come Day, exploring the collective witness of the formerly enslaved. And the author
mm,
has taken these WPA narratives and interviews that we have from people who had been enslaved when they were children and now they're elderly, and they're giving these interviews, and we have the recordings. Our nation has the recordings. And she writes a book integrating those in, but with a fictional narrator who's
mm,
drawing the story together. I mean, talk about some good storytelling. It's so
mm.
good. And then randomly, I'm reading this book called Well Lived, Shaping a
Ooh,
Legacy of Gratitude and Grace by Sally Clarkson. And she's using these reflections of her time as a grandmother in Oxford. And it has a lot of her personal photography in it. And she's telling stories kind of. This is not how she describes it. This is my description. This is how she became a good and grown woman. And talking about,
I need
man,
that book.
right? Another stage of
Here to
life.
be like, please get grown.
Please tell me the secrets. So those are all three totally different books. And then I constantly have poetry going, just ongoing,
Mm.
on an ongoing basis. So
Love the poetry. And no, I just read this book, and we're going to send it to you after this, Amber. Your Brain on Art. I've been advocating for this for a long time, but these neuroscientists talk about the impact of poetry on our brains, and how good it is for us, and how healing it can be for us. And it just takes a minute, and it does the way that, poetry is set up and what it does to our minds is really extraordinary. So, big poetry fans over here. Well, Amber, it's been a pleasure, and we're so glad to have you. And please follow Amber. You will love her on socials. Check out her blog. There's so many wonderful things there too. Lots of wonderful references. And if you're thinking like, I don't even know where to begin in exploring the diversity of books that I could be exposing my kids to or myself to. I think parents start with yourselves first, dive into those stories. That is a great landing spot, and that is a great place to get the party started. So lots of love to you, story makers, and we will catch you soon. Thanks for listening. Today's episode of the Storymakers podcast was made possible by donors and produced by Mockingbird Ministries. Listen to more episodes and join the adventure at storymakersnyc.com or follow us along on Instagram. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, share the show with a friend or maybe two and use the code SMPodcast10 for 10% off your next order. Catch you next time.